So fun. So every week after I leave Robson Park, I'll get here and I'll text Shelley and I'll say, what do I need to change from the first sermon to the second? She says, so here's the word today. This is the word I have to pass on to you. It's heavy. So get ready. And we're going to dive in. This is both joy. No, it's just total joy. I get to be in the text and find all these things, all these nuggets all week long. And then I get to bring them here to you guys on Sunday. And so I'm going to do my very best to pass them on. We only got to verse 14 at Robson Park, and then I had to quit. So let's see how far we get here. But it's heavy lifting. So get your Bibles, get your study guides if you've got them, and we're going to go into this text together. Let's back up. Review. We're in Malachi. This is week 3. Week 1, you realize that there's these disputes that go on between God and his people. They're debating, they're arguing, they're going back and forth. And in week 1, God says to them, why are you questioning my covenant love? I love you. It's a covenant love. And they go, you do? When's the last time we saw it? We get into week 2. And we know that the dispute was around worship. God's saying to them, look, you're bringing leftovers instead of your best. In fact, there was anger and frustration and disputing, even with the leaders, the priests, for letting the people bring less than their best. The Jews knew that how you worship tells everybody around what you believe about God. Well, we come to week 3, and here we are, chapter 2, verse 10 through 16. And you'll notice I skipped a few verses. Verse 1 through verse 9 of chapter 2. It kind of goes with last week's sermon. And if you want like real Cole's notes of the thing, it basically says this. It's about the priests. And because they blew it in letting people worship in a haphazard way, God literally says, I'm going to take the dung of the deformed animals that you're presenting to me, and I'm going to smear it all over you. Didn't think we needed a whole sermon on that. So we're going to skip right past that, and we're going to go to the next section, all right? Here's this next section about faithfulness. God is a faithful God, and we have been an unfaithful people. And when we're unfaithful, we bear witness to who God is falsely. I was remembering just this week a story. I had a professor at Wheaton College. His name was Gilbert Bilzekian. Say that 3 times fast. Dr. B. That was easier. That's what everybody called him. Dr. B was a mentor to the leaders of Willow Creek Community Church. And if you haven't heard of that, it was one of the biggest, sort of most influential churches in all the United States a number of years ago. Not so much today, but it was then. And Dr. B shaped that church, shaped it around some of his teaching, and some of his best teaching was on the reality that God was one, the oneness of God. Well, we had Dr. B out here as a church. We had him out to Vancouver in about year 10, maybe it was 11, but somewhere back there. And we ended up, sorry, that's not AD 10, that would be year 10 of our life together. So it was back in around 2003, somewhere in there. And what we did with Dr. B is I picked him up at the airport to take him to our retreat out in Camp Hope. Jim, were you around when Dr. B came? Do you remember that? Yeah. You were, good. I picked him up at the airport and drove him all the way from Vancouver to Hope. Hour and a half, hour 45 minutes, somewhere in there. And the whole way along, he's asking questions about the church. By the time we got there and pulled into the driveway to go up to the lodge, he looks at me and he says, that's the strangest story of a church I've ever heard. He says, why do you do all that? That's just weird. And I thought, oh, well, I'm not really that glad we invited you anymore. So that's what was going on the inside. But the story doesn't end there. We had a great weekend together. Dr. B taught and did some great teaching, and we sat together at lunch on the Sunday before everybody went home, and he looked at me and he said, I get it now. I have not seen many churches in all my years that have demonstrated a depth of community, a oneness like you guys do. Well done. There's something about our life together that's been so important to us. And what I want to talk about today, what Malachi talks about to the Jews, and I think also to us, is how important it is for us to be faithful to one another, because it bears witness to who God is. Come with me to verse 10. We could spend the entire time on verse 10, but let's see if we can make some sense of it together in just a few minutes. Verse 10 is the banner over the whole section. Tough to interpret, tough to apply, but it's the pinnacle of everything. Everything else sort of flows out of verse 10. You'll notice as you glance at verse 10, there are 3 questions in verse 10. The whole verse is made up of just those 3 questions. The first 2 talk about God. The third one we'll come to in a minute, talks about us. The first 2 are rhetorical. The Jews already knew the answer, right? But Malachi asks them anyways, because what he's doing is he's drawing a dark line under them. Do we not have one Father? Notice the we. He's included, right? He's in there. He's in there like a dirty shirt. This is us. Of course we have one Father, and therefore we have one family. This goes back to the Abrahamic covenant that was read to us earlier. Genesis chapter 12. I'm going to make you into a great nation, a great people. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make you a blessing to all the nations. You're a spiritual family. I will be your God. You will be my people. Oneness. They belong to one another. Did not one God create us? Now you could say, well, that's almost the same thing, isn't it? No, it's not. It's actually a different question. The one family deals with the spiritual family. The one God who created us deals with something even better, even deeper, goes deeper. For this question pushes us even further into the oneness of God. It's about Him. It's about His faithfulness. Now we, New Testament people, followers of Jesus, we believe that the oneness of God is talking about the Trinity, that sense of Father, Son, and Spirit, 3 persons, one God. Jews didn't believe that, still don't. The oneness of God for a Jew was that they were monotheists. We are as well, but understand it differently than the Jews. But what this says is the one God created us. Theology lesson. This is the oneness of who God is. The same God created us all, but one commentator says it this way: the Jews knew deep within them that they were related, connected, they were one ethnically and religiously or spiritually. One Father, one God creates us all. He's faithful. He invites us into covenant. We are invited into that oneness for an intimate relationship with God and an intimate communal relationship with one another. Okay, that's the God part, and that's the first 2 questions, but come to the third one. Third one, heavy lifting here too. So Malachi says, why do we profane the covenant of our ancestors by being unfaithful to one another? It's not a rhetorical question, but they get it. The point is there. They've been unfaithful to one another. And the word that Malachi uses here is a big, big Hebrew word, deep and powerful word. It means mutual unfaithfulness. This isn't one of us, 2 of us, or even 5 of us being unfaithful. It's the whole lot of us, Malachi says. This is everyone being unfaithful to one another. It's unfaithfulness between covenant members of God's family. Ugh. In fact, the word means treachery. Or, said a different way, not only are you being unfaithful, you're putting a cloak over top of it to cover it up so that nobody knows. Double whammy. You're trying to hide your unfaithfulness. It's implied in the text. It means it in the very words that Malachi uses. There's a deep impact on the people of God. You know how they had 10 commandments, right? And their whole covenant sort of related to the 10 commandments. If you keep these 10 commandments, you're okay. Malachi says, well, not really. You could keep all these 10 commandments and not have a good relationship, be unfaithful to one another, and the 10 commandments actually don't matter a hoot anymore. Keep them all. Check them off. I did, but I'm not loving my brother or sister. Useless. Well, you can see ahead to where he's going with that. Isn't this what Jesus said to the Pharisees over and over and over again? When they're unfaithful to one another, it means they're unfaithful to God. I can say over and over again, I'm trying to be faithful to God, trying to be faithful to God. But God says, yeah, but if you're not faithful to your brothers and sisters, you're actually not faithful to me. One of my favorite passages in the New Testament, 1 John chapter 4, verse 7 to 12. We talk about it a fair bit. You'll remember it. It's all about the fact that God is love. Not just that he's loving, but he is love. That's his nature. And he's loving because he sends his son. And he tells us to love. Now you would think that the text would say, love God and therefore you're reciprocating. He doesn't say that. He says, love one another. Then you're reciprocating. In fact, if you love one another, God says, then I'm going to take it as if you're loving me. Okay, flip that coin over. If you're unfaithful to one another, you're unfaithful to God. That's what Malachi is talking about. When we are unfaithful to one another, in the same way as when we love one another, God receives it as love to him. When we're unfaithful to one another, he takes it as unfaithfulness to him. And oh, by the way, Malachi says, when one of you is unfaithful, it's not just one, it infects the whole batch. You're all unfaithful. Why? Because you profane the covenant, verse 10 says. We're in covenant with God and one another. It's God's nature. And when we are unfaithful to each other, we profane that covenant. In other words, we bear false witness to who God is. I could spend the rest of the morning talking about the next thing, which is this. I'm preparing the sermon, and I'm stopping at this point, and I'm thinking, well, okay, I should just go on to the next thing. No. God, how am I unfaithful? I try to be obedient, try to put you first with affection. And he says, yeah, but you're not always faithful to your brothers and sisters here at the church. And he starts to name some things. I'm guilty as much as anybody is. And when we come to this text, when we come to verse 10, we got to not just read it and say, okay, great, 3 questions, fine. We got to stop. We got to say, Lord, where am I being unfaithful to a brother and sister? Not listening. Not being present to them. Not caring. Not praying. Not engaged in the practices. There's lots and lots and lots of ways we're unfaithful. And this isn't about a guilt trip. This is about alerting us so that we can put it right. Well, come with me to verse 11 and 12. It's almost as if the people say to Malachi, well, okay, how are we being unfaithful? He says, well, thanks for asking. Let me give you 2 examples. And he starts in verse 11. Hear verse 11 and 12 again. Judah has been unfaithful. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying women who worship a foreign god. It's just verse 11. Let me stop there for a minute. The word means despicable. Judah has been despicable. They've done detestable things. They've made idols. And they put them front and center. How? By marrying daughters of other gods. In other words, they've married women who worship other gods. The word that Malachi uses is such a deep word, a rich word. It infers the depth of the infraction against God. It's moral failure. It's not just a little thing. It's not sorry, don't let that happen again. This is a big, deep thing that breaks covenant. Although the text seems to be against mixed marriages. It's not. At least not mixed marriages in the way that we think. It's nothing to do with ethnicity. It's everything to do with faithfulness or religious beliefs. I mean, it's common sense, Malachi would infer, isn't it? I mean, think about it. When you marry somebody from a different faith, what's the tension that's going to happen? When you marry someone from a different faith and you bring their faith into the oneness of community, what are you doing to the whole community? It's not just your marriage that's being affected, it's the entire community. See, in the history of Israel, they'd been warned. Remember, they come out of Egypt, they're crossing the wilderness, they're about to go into the promised land, and God says, be on your guard. Wait, pay attention. There are people in this land who will be worshiping other gods, and you need to not intermingle with them. You know what's going to happen. Who and how we worship leads to immoral behaviors if we're not worshiping the one and only true God. There was tension in the Jews. Remember, there were 12 tribes. 10 in the north, called Israel. 2 in the south. And even the fact that I'm telling you there were 10 and 2 tells you there was a fraction that happened in their midst. The northern kingdom, called Israel, were exiled in 720 and actually literally disappeared because they never came back. The southern, called Judah, were exiled in 590. They did come back. And this is who Malachi is writing to. And now he's saying, you've known it in your history, but now you're not paying any attention. You've come back from exile. You think you would have learned your lesson, but you didn't. You've married foreign women who worship foreign gods. What are they doing? They've put their individual desires for women ahead of the community need for ethics and morals. That's heavy. They've put their individual desires ahead of the needs of the community. Why does Malachi write both Jerusalem and Israel here in verse 11? Why? Because this is not something that one or two men are doing. This is pervasive. This is widespread. This is at the very center. Jerusalem was the center of the culture. It's where the temple was. It's where God resided. And what they've done is they've done it even into the temple and caused such turmoil. They're a covenant people who are denigrating God's name. What's the impact? The faithlessness of some impacts the faithfulness of the whole. The oneness of God with his people is destroyed. It affects every relationship. Every relationship suffers calamity. And there's defamation in the temple. Here, verse 12 again. As for the man who does this, whoever he may be, may the Lord remove him from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings an offering to the Lord Almighty. Malachi's not mincing words, friends. He's praying, God, take the person out. It's better that we lose the one who has brought this corruption, this unholiness into the midst of community. It's better that they're cast out than that the whole community suffers. Remove them not just from our gatherings. Remove them from the entire community. Friends, this is hard. This is heavy. We don't like to talk like this. Catch what he says here. Even though he brings an offering to the Lord Almighty. Yeah, Lord, we can't kick that person out. I know what they're doing is not really helpful, but when we gather together on Sunday, what they bring, that's so important to us. We need that. If they didn't bring that, Malachi says doesn't matter. There's implications for us. So many issues of idolatry in our midst. We don't even pay attention to them so often. I'm not just talking about being unequally yoked. I'm talking about being shaped by the culture and bringing idols into the center of our community. We need a whole day to unpack some of these. Where in the scripture does it talk about us being capitalists? You know, the money issues that we have to deal with. Money has become such an idol in our culture, and we don't even think about it. We don't even pay attention to it. There's tons. Entertainment, politics. One of the things I'm doing on my sabbatical is going to hang out with some friends in the States. I got to prepare myself for this because it's going to be one political conversation after another. We mess up inside. We mess up outside. When we bring idols into the midst, it causes tension within us and it causes tension without. Come with me to the second example, verses 13 to 14. And I'm going to do these in 2 or 3 minutes and we're going to come to communion. There's so much here in verses 13 to 16. Listen again, verse 13. And Malachi says, well, that's one example. When you marry people from other cultures, they bring their gods into the midst of community. But how about this one? Another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer looks with favor on your offerings or accepts them with pleasure from your hands. You ask why? It's because the Lord is the witness between you and the wife of your youth. You've been unfaithful to her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. There's a form of writing of poetry and prose where you go A, B, B, A, or in this sentence, in this text, in verse 11 and 12, we talked about the charge and then the consequences, and now in verse 13, we talk about the consequences and then the charge. Just flips it around. It's just a style of writing. So in verse 13, we have the consequences. The consequences are nobody gets it. God doesn't even listen to your songs, hear your prayers, or accept your offerings when you gather together. Then you start whining like little babies. That's what Malachi's saying. Why are you whining? Well, God doesn't hear our prayers. And I've been praying that God would deal with this for me, and he doesn't deal with this for me. We fall into that a lot, don't we? Come on, I fall into that. God, where are you? Where are you when you're not answering my prayers? Or when I come to worship and something just doesn't seem right? It doesn't seem like you're taking care of the circumstances that I want you to take care of. So we whine. This is the issue that Malachi's on about. They're complaining. They're trying to manipulate God. They're living an unexamined life. Well, okay, so why is God not responding? Because they've been unfaithful. They've been unfaithful. You've been unfaithful to the wife of your marriage covenant. What's that mean? You know, in those days, polygamy was a thing. Different reasons maybe than it is now. Polygamy was a thing because a man would get married to his wife, covenant, but then there were lots more women in the culture than there were men. Lots of wars, all kinds of reasons. And the men would take care of the women. But the one was a covenant one. It was a special one. And what Malachi's saying is, you know what? You guys, you're throwing the one away and you're causing a break in oneness with the community. And you might even be throwing her away because of the fact that, well, you got a little bit older and you traded her in for a younger model. Some things don't change. You've been unfaithful and you've caused havoc in the community. But here's the biggest reason. That when you married the one, when you married the woman that you met in your youth, that you covenanted with, when you married her, who was the witness? Kyson. If I need, you're absolutely right, if I need a loan, and I come and sit at your kitchen table and I say, Kyson, I got to have this loan. Is there any chance you'd co-sign with me? And you said, yeah, we're a community, I'm going to co-sign with you. And then I defaulted on that loan. Now what? It puts you in the soup. It puts your name in a bad place. It means you have to pay this stuff. This is what Malachi is saying about God. He witnessed you make a covenant with this woman, and now you've put her to the side. Who do you think it affects? It affects the woman, it affects the community, and it affects God. Oneness is broken. We got to stop. 15 and 16, God's against divorce. There's so many things in there that we have to pay attention to. It's not totally about marriage, this text. It uses examples about marriage because it's easy to talk about unfaithfulness. It's about unfaithfulness. It's about the breaking of covenant with God, with one another. And he uses these two examples. Friends, it's time for us to come. Come to the table. And not in a sense of guilt, but actually the opposite. In a total sense of joy. That a God who has made a covenant with us sees the unfaithfulness of us and yet came in the flesh to put the covenant back together, to give us a chance, to join with him in oneness again. That's his body. We take it, we eat it, we become one with him. To have his blood, the cup, to drink it, that cup of forgiveness, a new covenant that he's made with us. Let's pray and then come to the table. We'll give instructions in just a second.